Hi everyone, I'm Gary. And today we are going to talk about alignment, specifically the axes of law versus chaos, which is the oldest axes in the game. Originally, when alignment was added to D&D, in its earliest days, there was no good and evil axes. And I think that this compass now that we now kind of all subscribe to or we use in our games effectively has reached a point where it's vestigial and it doesn't really serve any purpose. There's definitely no mechanical purpose to alignment. And there is a big debate or a big discussion to be had as to whether alignment is a description of a character's actions or is it a description of their personality? And which of those two things would be mutable if that is the case? Like, can you change alignment or can you not? Now, it's worth saying that alignment was not originally conceived in this way. Alignment was, as I said, just law and chaos. You were either law and chaotic, right? You're either one or the other. And these were two kind of inimical, universal forces that were in conflict with each other. And your character chose where they were aligned. Maybe alignment is the bad word for the mechanic, right? Because it was more like, who are they allied with? What is their allegiance? Is it to the forces of law or is it to the forces of chaos? So it wasn't a description of their personality at all. It was actually a description of their kind of belief, like their belief system, like their alignment, like cosmically. Now, what I'd like to do is give some examples of where law and chaos come from, kind of literary. So we're going to look at some historical texts and we're going to work our way forward to the game so you can understand where these things emerge. And then you can make your decision as why alignment even continues to exist and maybe, maybe it shouldn't. Or maybe it needs a serious rethink. What I'm not going to do is, while I'm going to give some examples of extreme kind of law and extreme chaos in fiction, I'm not going to talk about these things in terms of historical moments. We could, if we wanted to talk about the excesses of the dictators of the 20th century in terms of excessive lawfulness or excessive chaos, but I'm not a historian. I'm not confident talking about those particular examples. So we are going to look at this from a literary point of view. So let's start at the beginning. Our schema for what chaos is, and it's easier to define chaos, I think, interestingly, is that chaos is a triumvirate of three qualities, and law is just the opposite of these things. So the triumvirate of chaos would be a character who believes in these three things, or engages these three things, or does these three things. One, personal liberty, right? The ability to carve your way in the world, a sense of agency. That is very chaotic, and we'll explain why that is as we go through. Also, the second thing is the character should be an outsider of some kind. So they don't exist within a structure, or if they do, they're really against that structure. So they're an outsider. They may exist within a community, but they're not part of that community. And then finally, destruction, ruin, the actual desire to break things that are created, not existing. I've said if they're an outsider in a structure, wanting to break that structure. So actual destruction. And then it's worth saying that while I would not consider it a kind of an inherent quality of chaos, often these things are filtered through a sense of Faustian magic, so sorcery, magic. The secondary world is really important to a chaotic character. Now, let's just roll back. And where do all these ideas come from? Well, the example I'd like to use is actually Shakespeare. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, oh, God, like Gary's going to start talking Shakespeare. I am, but just bear with me for like a minute. So if we look at Shakespeare's play Macbeth, which was first performed probably 1606, very old, Macbeth is a really good example of proto-Gothic fiction, but I would also say it's a really good example of proto-fantasy fiction, and specifically gives us a really cool, interesting schema of the world order. And I do think it gives us the schema of not just good and evil, but it gives us a really interesting schematic example of order versus chaos, law versus chaos. So in that play, what happens is, in really simple terms, is there is a good guy, Macbeth. He's a great Scottish warrior, and he is stopped on the way back from a battle at the very beginning. And he is stopped by these three witches. He's with his best friend. And these three witches say to Macbeth, you will be Thane of Cawdor, which is another place in Scotland, and then eventually you'll become king. And what this does is it prompts Macbeth to start to consider the world as somewhere where he can act out his ambitions, right? Before, it's not clear to what extent he would have wanted to become king anyway. And what Macbeth goes on to do is he goes and kills the current king, who's a really gracious guy, a really good, really noble man called Duncan, and he eventually becomes king. And, the play goes on. He meets the witches again. He becomes a complete tyrant. Eventually, he's killed by the characters. But what's interesting about this is this idea of chaos. The witches, as I've said, sorceress characters, the witches who are outsiders stop Macbeth on the heath in a wild place outside of the rest of society. And they tell him, you could become king, or you will become king, which prompts his personal liberty, prompts his ambition to then go off and start thinking, maybe I should kill the king. He tells his wife, and she's like, really, yeah, this is a really good idea. And the idea of destruction is fantastically kind of played out. I mean, it's an incredibly violent version of Scotland that's presented in that play. It starts with a battle, it starts with the beheading of a traitor and ends with the beheading of a traitor. But it's not just destruction as a kind of abstract quality. We go, there's lots of destruction there. It's something that is mentioned several times. This idea of ruin, this idea of breaking the natural order, right? Macbeth, when he finds Duncan, he's killed King Duncan, and he pretends to find the body in front of the other characters, and he describes the wounds, the dagger marks on the king's body as breaches in nature for ruin's wasteful entrance. It's almost as if this character Duncan was a kind of stopper on chaos, and now his body's physically broken. Ruin can bleed into the world, and that's really interesting. So I think this is where we see the beginning of chaos and law, or an early example of lawfulness and chaos. And you can see this in other kind of like older English texts. You might even see it in some actual old English texts, but I can't think of any off the top of my head. But that is a really good example of what I'm talking about. And it's interesting that it is filtered through Faustian sorcery, engaging with the witches, engaging with the supernatural. Then let's just cut forward a bit. So there is this idea percolating away. I think it kind of maybe falls out of favor slightly in the Victorian period, kind of like, the early modern period. And then what happens is we get the kind of instatement of two kind of opposing forces conceptualizing two ideas, lawfulness, kind of mundane, real, with the unreal and the supernatural. And in 1924, I think it is, Lord Dunsany writes one of the most important fantasy novels ever written. He writes The King of Elfland's Daughter. And this is fantastic. If you've never read it, you should read it. I reread it as often as I can afford the time, because it's so fantastically wonderful in its descriptions. And in that, there is a group of, there's like a community, the Vale of Earl, somewhere it's kind of implied to be England. It is set in the real world, but it could almost be a kind of secondary fantasy, a secular kind of fantasy like Middle Earth. And in the Vale of Earl, the Parliament of Earl have approached their lord, and they have said to him, don't want to be really ruled by you anymore. We would like to be ruled by a magical lord, because that would be so much better if our lord was like a magician of some kind. So the son of the lord, Alfric, says, well, what I'll do is I will travel to Elfland. I'll travel to Fairy. I'll travel to the secondary world, and I will try and marry the King of Elfland's daughter. And that will mean that any children we have are then, you have a magical lord. You've introduced it. And this is so fantastic, because as Alfric travels, he passes from a place of mundane artifice, very obvious, right? Law, the community of the Parliament of Earl. These people desire this, but they're in a group together, and he passes out of this into the wilderness, yeah? And he goes and gets the King of Elfland's daughter, the Princess Lirazel. Now, she is an outsider, and he brings her in, and this causes all sorts of problems. And it ultimately ends, in fact, I won't spoil it, because I think you should read it. If you are sat there thinking, I really like fantasy, this is something that I feel kind of in my bones, like I do, I think you should go away and read The King of Elfland's Daughter. But it's just interesting, again, that you have this idea of two opposing kind of groups. You have the mundane, the Christian, the community, and it's actually kind of for and against, but it's definitely separate to the outside Elfland, and the magic. And then if we just skip forward a little bit more, we get to really the beginning of the first kind of like real example of this in fantasy literature. The first example where we see people like Gygax and Anderson actually pointing at it and going, this is where this comes from. So in the early 60s, we have Poul Anderson. Apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong. I've only ever seen it written down. Poul Anderson writes Three Hearts and Three Lions. He's an American fantasy author. And in Three Hearts and Three Lions, it's interesting in how close it is to the King of Elfland's daughter. But this is the first time we have it stated on the page, as far as I know, in the terms that we understand, this idea of I am an agent of law acting against the agents of chaos. And it's fantastically interesting because what happens is you have Holger the Dane. Holger, he is a German, he's a Danish resistance fighter against the Germans in the Second World War. He suffers some kind of injury and he wakes up in the Middle Ages. He actually wakes up in Carolingian myth. He doesn't realize it. He's not in a kind of real historical world. He's in kind of like Arthurian kind of like fantasy land. And what he has to do is he has to get the sword Cortana to stop the encroachment of chaos, which is this kind of like Eastern force that's coming. Very, very, very interesting. The idea of kind of lawfulness West, chaos East, right? You know, if we're talking about after the Second World War and the Cold War and things like that, really interesting. But in that text, law is kind of like righteousness and Christianity again. It's the kind of like ordered sense of the world, the divine sense of the world. And against it, where you have the outside world again, you have fairy, right? You have everything that tries to stop him are magical creatures. And that's what's going on. And reality kind of breaks down as he starts to go further east and it becomes more and more kind of magical and less real. And that is so cool. The world itself kind of bleeds into destruction, which is really interesting. Now, that is really where law and chaos comes from. There's a couple of other things that come from that. You get the idea of the way trolls are conceived in early D&D comes directly from that book. There's a fight where Holger has to fight this troll. Swan Maze as well. They also kind of are inspired by that book. Really cool. And then we get the most important text that informs law and chaos in D&D, in fantasy gaming. And that is Elric of Melniboné, the writings of the pulp author Michael Moorcock. Now, Michael Moorcock is a British author who came up with this idea of the Eternal Champion. So this, like, different characters in different books of his, in different worlds, in different settings, they experience the same or very similar events. And it's because they have this kind of like, they are like an agent of balance within the cosmos against kind of like the destruction of law or chaos, or the disbalance of law versus chaos. It's really interesting. And his most famous swordsman, Elric of Melniboné, it's like, this is really cool. His most famous swordsman, Elric of Melniboné, he is absolutely subscribed to chaos. He is the last emperor of the kind of slave empire of Melniboné, and he rejects that kind of that community. He goes traveling. That's what those stories are about. So he's an outsider in a world where he would otherwise be exceptionally powerful. He subscribes to the Duke of Hell. He creates a Faustian pact with Ariok, this kind of demon lord, who in exchange bequeaths him power, right? And bequeaths him deviltry and warlockry, and that gives him a real kind of sense of powerful sorcery. But what's going on there is that same thing again. You have the outsider who is engaging with this kind of personal fantasy he has of liberty, right? This, I'm going to do what I want in this world, and come hell or high water, that is what I'm going to do. And that indicates his allegiance to chaos. And that is so interesting. I mean, it's fantastically interesting. And obviously his empire is on the verge of its own destruction because he's just not engaging with that as a structure. And again, what does Eric actually give him? He gives him sorcery, magic, right? So magic is personal liberty. Magic is destruction. Magic is the outsider. Magic is chaos. And then we get to D&D. So Gygax and Arneson and a lot of these early D&D authors, they are looking at a lot of these things, and they're kind of going, okay, like, this is how we kind of take these. And they're looking at authors specifically like Poul Anderson and Michael Moorcock, and going, this is what law and chaos is. And this is why I believe that this whole idea of like, those weird kind of like 3x3 grids of the kind of 9 alignments in 5e, they're really kind of, they're kind of cool, but they're also a massive distraction from what this is actually meant to be, which is you pledging yourself, you pledging your soul and your allegiance to a particular cosmic force. And lastly, we can kind of go post D&D because this is important. I would say where this is best played out is in the late 80s. Games Workshop, the British wargame manufacturer, they released Warhammer. And in that, you have the inimical force of the world is chaos. And what is chaos? It is a byword for magic in that setting. You have Norscan raiders who have pledged themselves to Chaos Lords coming south, burning and destroying and attempting to unmake the world. Why? Why do they want this? Because they have chosen that. Because that is their personal choice. It is their liberty. And that's exactly what chaos is in Warhammer 40,000 as well. It is a sense of personal liberty. I'm choosing to make this decision for myself and, to hell with everybody else, basically. And it makes you an outsider. You are against the order structures of the world. If it's 40k, you're against the God Emperor. If it is Warhammer Fantasy, you are against the Empire, the Grand Theogenist, the artifice of empire, the artifice of kingdoms and society. And that's why it's interesting, and you're going to try and destroy that. I love the idea that this is the final culmination of many years of kind of refinement of these two concepts. And it doesn't just end there, because we can talk about antagonistic and protagonistic forces that are represented by law and by chaos, and also by neutrality. Another word, kind of like the bonus thing to mention, is that one of the primary antagonistic forces in Terry Pratchett's Discworld universe is the Auditors. And the Auditors are exactly what they sound like. They're like cosmic auditors that make sure the balance is maintained. But they're not very nice. They're very kind of like, they are villainous. I'm avoiding saying evil because it's kind of a marked term in this discussion, but they are definitely villainous, and they are definitely working against, almost always against, the characters. But they are forces of neutrality. I really don't buy this concept that like, oh, my rogue is true neutral. That means that they're like ultra selfish. It's like, that's not what alignment is. Alignment isn't just a measure of one's selfishness or selflessness. It's something else, actually. And it's very telling that in second edition AD&D, the druids, to be a druid, you must be true neutral, because you are pledging yourself to neutrality, to the kind of elemental balance of the universe. And that is so interesting, especially because druids are kind of, outsiders within a religious kind of structure, and they're being kind of pushed out of that. It's really, really, really interesting. But that is my conception of law versus chaos. So a lawful character is not about personal liberty. It is about the community. It is about helping people. The outsider in chaos is the insider in law. And destruction doesn't become creation with a lawful character. Destruction becomes artifice. It becomes structure. It becomes, organization and society. It doesn't become necessarily creation, because creation can also be magic. It can also be chaos. That's my ideas around law versus chaos. I hope you found it interesting and that you've taken something kind of like, at least some food for thought from this. If you have anything interesting to say, if you have any comments or questions, please just drop them below. I'd love to hear them. But otherwise, I'm Gary. Thank you for listening. I'll speak with you again soon.